There we go.
All right.
You like that?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Somerville Church of Christ. Hope y'all are all doing well this morning. I have to admit to you, the pollen is hitting me this morning, so I apologize if you hear me sniffling a little bit. Hopefully we'll get some rain today and tomorrow, and I'll wash some of it off. We're going to be in 1 Kings 22 this morning, if you want to flip over to that. And you know, when Don Allen and I were talking about this class, you know, we focused on Elijah. We called it, you know, renewing the people of God. Elijah is going to be the person we're talking about. But really, we've talked about Ahab just about as much as we've talked about Elijah, haven't we? You know, Elijah and Ahab are really kind of two sides of the coin, right? They've been going back and forth this whole story. Well, I don't want to spoil it too bad for you, but this morning we're going to talk about the end of Ahab. All right. Ahab is going to no longer be a character in our story after this morning. And we're going to take 2 weeks on this story, like I said last week. Hopefully this morning we will finish getting through the text, but if we don't, that's okay. I got next week. So we're going to take our time with it, make sure we really understand what's going on, okay? So if you will flip with me to 1 Kings chapter 22. And we're going to read verse 5 verses. Now 3 years have passed without war between Syria and Israel. Now, depending on your translation, that may say Aram instead of Syria. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. Then it came to pass in the 3rd year that Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went down to visit the king of Israel. And the king of Israel said to his servants, "Do you know that Ramoth in Gilead is ours, but we hesitate to take it out of the hand of the king of Syria?" So he said to Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to fight at Ramoth Gilead?" Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." Also Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Please inquire for the word of the Lord today." So the story starts off with a note that 3 years has passed. And this is 3 years since the end of chapter 20. If you want to flip back and look there, you remember in chapter 20, Israel went to fight with Aram or Syria, depending on your translation. And the king was named Ben-Hadad. I think Don Allen talked about that for us a few weeks ago. He went and with the Lord's help, they conquered that battle. They won the battle, but then Ahab made a treaty with Ben-Hadad, right? And instead of killing him, he let him go. And part of that treaty was surrendering some territory. Well, now 3 years have passed by, and that territory has not been surrendered. And so that's what Ahab's talking about here. He says, "Hey, we made this treaty. You said you were going to surrender this land. It hasn't been surrendered. It might be time for us to go take it." We're also introduced to a new character here, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. What do y'all know? Do y'all have any background knowledge or any ideas about what the relationship between Israel and Judah was at this time? Remember, Jehoshaphat's the king of Judah. Ahab is the king of Israel.
Well, they were actually part of it. It was a divided kingdom. Judah was part of like 2 tribes, and then there was 10 tribes in Israel.
Right.
And that was after Solomon had died.
Mm-hmm. So Israel and Judah had kind of diverged in their paths, right? We tend to think of Judah as a little bit more God-fearing. They held more tightly to the covenant than Israel did. But here we see Jehoshaphat is kind of allied with King Ahab, right? This is actually a story that is told in 2 Chronicles 18 as well. You can flip over to that. I'll reference it a little bit. But it's told from Judah's point of view in 2 Chronicles 18. Most of the text is exactly the same, the main gist of the story. There's a few little things that are added in 2 Chronicles 18. But if we flip over to that real quick, that gives us a little bit more background into Jehoshaphat. So I'm going to flip over to that and read it. You can flip over there, or you can just listen. 2 Chronicles 18. Jehoshaphat had riches and honor and abundance. So remember, we're talking about the kingdom of Judah now. Jehoshaphat's the king of Judah. And by marriage, he allied himself with Ahab. After some years, he went down to visit Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed sheep and oxen in abundance for him and the people who were with him, and persuaded him to go with him to Ramoth Gilead. Remember, that's the territory that's under dispute. So Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, "Will you go with me against Ramoth Gilead?" And he answered him, "I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will be with you in the war." Also Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Please inquire for the word of the Lord today." And then from there, the story is pretty much word for word with 2 Kings 22. But what is this passage? It gives us a little bit more background into Jehoshaphat. What's the relationship between Jehoshaphat and King Ahab?
Apparently, son-in-law, father-in-law.
Yeah, isn't that something? You know, we started off
That
talking
was
about...
common, you know, that was common.
Yeah.
I mean, how'd he get Jezebel?
Right, exactly. That's what I was just about to say. We started off the class talking about how Israel had made an alliance with Phoenicia by marrying Ahab and Jezebel. And now we see Judah making an alliance with Israel by marrying, being united in marriage here. And we talked about this a little bit at the very beginning of this series, but why would Israel and Judah, or why would Judah in this case, want to make some sort of alliance? Why would they be looking for friends right now? Well, if you remember, we got a little map up here. If you remember, at this time, the area was pretty fractured between all these different nations. But up at the very top there, you see the Assyrian Empire starting to grow. And that was really becoming a threat. And so these nations, these kingdoms, had started making alliances in preparation for Assyria coming to fight them. And of course, Israel and Judah, you know, they had a lot of history, so they make a little bit more sense as an alliance than maybe Israel and Phoenicia did. All right, any thoughts about those first few verses there? We also see a little bit of maybe the differences between Judah and Israel, right? What does Jehoshaphat ask Ahab to do before they go to battle?
Seek the counsel of the Lord.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar also prayed before he moved on in his work in building the wall. It's the same thing that we should be doing, is praying before we make certain decisions or seek to do something else in our life. So
Absolutely.
always seeking God's counsel for that.
What do you think Ahab might have thought of that request? To seek the counsel of the Lord. We kind of left Ahab and the Lord off on better terms than they have been, right? Ahab had repented, the Lord had relented in judgment, if you remember from last chapter. Now 3 years have passed, we don't know exactly what has happened in that time. But Ahab, as we're about to see, Ahab at least has some sort of prophets that are going to come talk.
And not the right.
Ma'am?
but not the right one.
Yeah,
You
maybe.
listen to the right
Well,
one.
we'll see, won't we? All right, any other thoughts about these opening verses here?
But
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I think of Nehemiah when I read this, he counseled the Lord before Nehemiah went to work to rebuild the wall. He prayed about it. And so often, this is so relevant for us. We'll get in a project, we'll get something planned, and all of a sudden it fails, what we need to pray about. And probably we're very timid about praying after we start something, and it fails, but we have to realize that praying should have started at the very beginning. Do not wait till you get knee deep in something and your feet get muddy and then you mess up. You have to put God in his place where he's, you know,
Absolutely. Thank you, Dale.
You know, Zach, the thing that's really neat is today's a new day. It's a new day for him to make a decision to seek God and his counsel to do the things that God wants him to do. And it's the same thing for us today. Today's a new day. Whatever happened yesterday is over and done with. And so we can make changes in our lives today, right now. And it just shows you the love of God, the mercy of God, and the grace of God that he gives us opportunity to change our path. And here's an opportunity for him to change his path right here.
Yeah.
So the story will tell us if he does or doesn't as we go through it. So
Yeah, and we see that patience of God with Ahab, right? Because as we've been studying, we've seen Ahab mess up time and time and time again, and have the opportunity to repent time and time and time again. But he keeps passing it by, and then finally last week he did repent, and God accepts it, right? God's always given chances to us.
But wasn't that, Elijah was with him when they went, did that repent, did that. But about that time, didn't Elisha sort of take over and Elijah,
Yeah.
like retired or something, I don't know.
Elisha has been introduced. Last week we were never told Elisha was there. I bet he was, but we're not told specifically about the
But
text.
now the 3 years have passed.
Yeah,
And if if Elisha was doing anything with him, then maybe he wasn't listening to Elisha as much as he was Elijah,
yeah.
because he
Well,
knew him better.
we're gonna see a prophet show up, and we'll see what happens. Sherry, do you have something to say?
It always stands out to me all through the whole Old Testament, how when the people are in trouble, they rely on God. But when things are going great, not so much. And I think, well, that's the same, I know that's been the same for me. And I take great comfort in reading these stories and knowing that, like Bill said, today's a new day.
Absolutely.
You can always come to God and repent and
Yes, ma'am.
You
All right.
know, that,
Yeah.
she's saying that if you ever want to see, in my opinion, if you ever want to see how we as people are with God, take a toddler for a walk in the park. You know, because when everything's good, the toddler don't want you to touch them, you know?
Right.
But as soon as something doesn't satisfy the toddler, you're the first one they turn to. You know what I mean? And then you get the problem solved, and then they don't want you to touch them again. They want to toddle every time I think about it, that has to be when God is dealing with us, you know?
Yeah.
He's just kind of sitting there, you know, waiting for us to ask for help.
Yeah, that's a good example. All right, let's see how Ahab reacts to this request to seek God's counsel. So we'll pick up in verse 6. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them, "Shall I go against Ramoth Gilead to fight, or shall I refrain?" So they said, "Go up, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." And Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not still a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of him?" So the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "There is still one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil Jehoshaphat said, "Let not the king say such things." Then the king of Israel called an officer and said, "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly." So, we see Jehoshaphat's willing to help Ahab, but he wants to check with God first. We've talked about how that's a wise decision by Jehoshaphat. So Ahab calls together 400 prophets, and they prophesy that God will give Israel victory. But there's something not quite right about these prophets. What do you think about these 400 prophets?
Sounds like we're close to the 700 or so that were killed before on Mount Carmel.
Well, what's Jehoshaphat's reaction to these 400 prophets?
They're not prophets of God.
Jehoshaphat seems to think there's something not quite right about these prophets, right? He says, "Is there not still a prophet of the Lord here?" Now, the exact identity of these prophets is not clear, right? They could be prophets of Baal or Asherah. It would be a little bit strange to have them using God's name if they were those types of prophets, but maybe they knew their audience and they knew who they were talking to, and so they incorporated God in there a little bit. It's also possible that these prophets, say they're prophets of God, but they're really prophets of Ahab, right? They're really more of yes men. What do I mean when I say a yes man? What do I mean by that?
They tell the king what he wants to hear.
They tell the king what he wants to hear. Exactly. Well, so what's your sense? Do you think that these are prophets of Baal? Do you think they're yes men prophets? Do you have a leaning one way or the other? Or do you just agree with Jehoshaphat that whatever they are, they're not quite prophets of God? Norman, you got something?
Yeah, not quite there. I was thinking about the prophets. Whenever you read, I'm currently going in with Elijah. I'm in the book of Elijah. Well, Elijah was at the same time Jeremiah was. But they didn't work together. Elijah is up in Babylon, and Jeremiah is still in Judah. But they work independently. And all the times, whenever we read them, whatever the Maya prophecies that we read about, or so, they all work independent. They don't have 400 people. They don't have. The only time, a couple of times, worked together was Elijah and Elisha. Sort of came at the same time, but they still sort of were independent. So any of God's prophets are usually one, not 400 or 50 or whatever you want to number there.
Anybody else? What do you think about these prophets? Prophets of Baal, yes men, what do you think? Lynn?
Well, as an officer in the military, I would always get answers on stuff. I'd ask a question, and if they immediately replied, it either mean one of two things. Either they're really confident in the answer, they already knew it, or they're just giving me the easy answer. And I would always ask that question, are you just giving me the easy answer here, or is this the real truth?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, it was just the easy answer. And I found that so many people do that. And I think that's exactly what Jehoshaphat's smelling here is he's going, they're just giving you the easy answer. They're telling you what you want to hear. There's absolutely no pushback. 400 of them, and they're all saying the exact same thing. Right? It's the easy answer. And I would always go back to people and say, I don't want the easy answer. Because it means it's probably not the right answer.
Right. Knowing what we know about Ahab's character, does it surprise you that he may have surrounded himself with people who would tell him what he wants to hear? It doesn't surprise me. Ahab does not like the hard answer. He wants the easy answer, like Lynn was saying. He wants to be told he's doing what's right, that things are going to work out for him. Everything's going to be okay. But when you're making important decisions, what type of people do you want around you? Honesty.
I'll tell you the truth.
Somebody will tell you the truth.
Someone with integrity.
Integrity, that's a good word. Yeah. How is, well, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll wait for a minute. But, you know, when you're making a important decision, you don't want people who are just going to tickle your ear and tell you what you want to hear, right? In Proverbs, there's a few verses I could pull from Proverbs. I pulled Proverbs 11, verse 14. It says, "Where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in multitude of counselors there is safety." So that doesn't just mean straight numbers, right? Because he had 400 prophets saying the same thing. But sometimes you need some people of different ideas, different backgrounds, people that aren't just going to tell you what you want to hear, right? Now, Jehoshaphat recognizes that something's not right here, because he asked specifically for a prophet of the Lord. And what does Ahab say to that? Ahab says, yeah, there's this one guy. And I was expecting him to say Elijah, right? But he doesn't say Elijah. He says this guy named Micaiah. Now, Micaiah is the first time we're introduced to this particular prophet, although Jewish tradition holds that Micaiah is the unnamed prophet from chapter 20. You remember in that chapter there was an unnamed prophet who came and prophesied to Ahab about the battle. So Jewish tradition holds that that's the same guy. You know, the text doesn't say. But it's kind of funny to me that he doesn't think of Elijah, he thinks of Micaiah. But he says Micaiah always does what? What's Micaiah do? Micaiah doesn't tell him what he wants to hear, does he? Micaiah always prophesies evil about me, not good. So there's at least a few prophets telling Ahab stuff he doesn't want to hear, right? We got Elijah and we got Micaiah.
Pretty straightforward in verse 14. He said, I can only tell him what the Lord has tells me.
Yeah, we're gonna see and get introduced to Micaiah in a second here. All right, any other thoughts about that section before we move on?
That's how people respond to the truth a lot of times. If I don't like the truth, I can figure out some way to justify how it's not the truth. Instead of saying, okay, that's the truth, now I have to adjust to it.
Yeah.
It's no, there must be something wrong with your truth, so let me find someone else. I mean, this is just human nature. We do it constantly as people.
Absolutely. If we don't like what you say, we'll find somebody who will tell us what we want to hear, right? All right, let's see what Micaiah thinks about this whole situation.
You know, it's the same way as studying the scripture.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that they read and in most cases, they have a predetermined opinion on what something should be, and then they search scriptures out to support that, and then they hunt people that will support their opinion, and the next thing you know, you've got a group of people that are headed in the wrong direction.
And it's real easy to find people who will tell you what you want to hear, right? They'll get off on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I know some of you were at our social media seminar we had a few weeks ago, and we talked about echo chambers. And basically that's just when you get through Facebook or whatever your social media platform is, it learns what you like and it learns what you want to hear, and it'll feed you that. And it'll keep feeding it to you until you're full up and about to explode of it. And so, you know, there's definitely things today working to just tell you what you want to hear. So it's something we have to be aware of.
Well, 2 Timothy, I won't read it, you can look at it later. 2 Timothy 4:3 tells us basically that.
Mm-hmm.
Why won't they read it? Go ahead and read it. Don't take that long.
For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But again, he's telling Timothy, but you keep your head in all situations, endure hardships, do the work of the evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. So, you know, we want something to suit ourselves, or what we think, what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Alyssa?
Yeah, and it's so easy to see when other people are doing this, right? I bet we are all thinking of people we know who are not us, who are entrenched in these echo chambers, who are just constantly seeking out people to affirm what they already believe. This is something that each and every one of us, I think, are invited to by this text to consider about ourselves, right? Where are we just seeking out what we want to hear and making sure that's replicated to confirm our own biases and presuppositions?
Absolutely.
Not that that's easy to do.
No, it's not. All right, let's see what Micaiah thinks about all this. Verse 10. The king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, having put on their robes, sat each on his throne at a threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria. And all the prophets prophesied before them. Now Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, had made horns of iron for himself. And he said, Thus says the Lord, with these you shall gore the Syrians until they are destroyed. And all the prophets prophesied so, saying, Go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the king's hand. Then the messenger who had gone to call Micaiah spoke to him, saying, Now listen. And the words of the prophets with one accord encouraged the king. Please, let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak encouragement. And Micaiah said, As the Lord lives, whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak. Then he came to the king, and the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or shall we refrain? And he answered him, Go and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king. And the king said to him, How many times will I make you swear that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? Then Micaiah said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, Did I not tell you he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? So while these two kings are waiting for Micaiah to show up, they're sitting at their throne, and the prophets, the 400 prophets, are still really trying to sell Jehoshaphat on their prophecy, right? They're all prophesying. One of them even goes and gets a prop, right? An object lesson. He gets these two horns and says, with these horns, you're going to gore your enemies. We know how much our preachers love props, right?
Right.
A jug of water that never runs out. Things like that. But they're really trying to sell Jehoshaphat. Like, hey, we're telling the truth, man. Look how sure we are of what's going on.
God did that too,
Mm-hmm.
through his prophets at times, for us them to do object lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we kind of switch scenes here. We go from all the prophets and the king to Micaiah and this messenger that's been sent to get him. And the messenger has a little bit of advice for Micaiah, doesn't he? What's his advice for Micaiah?
Say what we say.
Say what we say. Right. He says, listen, Micaiah, I like you. I don't want you to get hurt. That's the kind of sense I get from this messenger. He says, please, just say what everybody else says. Don't make this difficult. Don't make this hard on yourself. Just do what everybody else is doing. And that's a real mission, isn't it? I mean, just put yourself in Micaiah's shoes. You're going in front of these two kings. You've got 400 prophets who have worked themselves into a tizzy, prophesying that everything's going to be good. Do you really have the fortitude to stand up there and say, actually, things aren't going to be so good? How hard is that? Or have you ever been in a situation, you can just think back, you don't necessarily have to share them this morning, but I'm sure you can think of times where you've had to go against what the majority thought or what the majority was doing. And it's never easy to do, is it? But what does Micaiah say about where he gets the strength to do that? What's Micaiah's answer to this messenger who's saying, just do what everybody else does? What's his answer to him?
You speak what the Lord tells you.
He says, I can only do what God tells me. Right? I'm only going to say what God says. And isn't that something to aspire to, right? If we could only act the way that God would act, if only what we said would be what God said. That's something aspirational for us to work towards, I think. Even when it's difficult. All right, any other thoughts about the conversation between Micaiah and the messenger here? All right, so then we get Micaiah in front of the two kings. And what does Micaiah prophesy at first?
Everything's gonna be fine.
Yeah. And, Ahab reacts by saying, basically quit pulling my leg. So I get the feeling that Micaiah was being sarcastic or mocking. He was obviously not giving a true prophecy. And Ahab recognized that and said, quit pulling my leg, tell me what's actually going to happen. So then Micaiah gives the true prophecy, right? What's the true prophecy say?
You're gonna lose.
Yeah. You're going to lose. Not only are you going to lose, what's going to happen to your kingdom?
Scattered.
Scattered. How do you think Ahab liked that? No king wants to see his kingdom scattered, right? The king of Israel, Ahab, turns to Jehoshaphat and says, see, I told you, this guy's a pessimist. He's not looking at the bright side of things. He never tells me anything good. But Micaiah's not finished. Let's look at verse 19.
Hey,
Oh, yeah.
real quick, this is clearly, when he says sheep without a shepherd, he's clearly saying, you're not gonna live through this. Because he's the shepherd, right? The king
Yeah.
is the shepherd. And it's interesting because that's the same phrase Jesus uses when he looks out over the crowds of people. They're like sheep without a shepherd. God, you see through the Old Testament and the New, God cares deeply about the leadership of his people. And this is one of those instances where he's telling the leader, here's what's going to happen. And it's not just going to be you that dies. What God's concerned about is my people are going to be scattered. All right? My sheep are not going to have a shepherd because of this. And it's just interesting that that's where the focus is. He's saying, yes, you're going to die, but he doesn't actually say it. He talks about the people.
Yeah, I wonder if Ahab picked up on that, if he made the connection that he's the shepherd. It's going to be made a lot more clear in a minute what's going to happen to Ahab. All right, verse 19. Micaiah's not finished. He's still got some more stuff to say. Verse 19, Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the hosts of heaven standing by on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth Gilead? So one spoke in this manner, and the other spoke in that manner. So God's basically asking for ideas, right? He says, what are we going to do? And ideas are being presented to him. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And the Lord said to the spirit, in what way? The spirit said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, you shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so. Therefore look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster against you. Now Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, went near and struck Micaiah on the cheek, and said, which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you? And Micaiah said, indeed you shall see on the day you go into an inner chamber to hide. So the king of Israel said, take Micaiah and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son. And say, thus says the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace. But Micaiah said, if you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, take heed, all you people. So what's the second part of Micaiah's prophecy here? He sees God up in heaven, surrounded by his court, right? It's kind of similar to the way God's described in the first chapter of Job, where God's kind of the, I guess you could say the king surrounded by his court. Maybe it's like the the president, surrounded by his cabinet. He's surrounded by advisors, kind of. They're bringing him ideas of things to do. And God says, this is what we want to do. We want to tempt Ahab and go in and fight in this battle. How are we going to do it? And so the spirits are coming and offering ideas. And finally one comes and says, I'll go be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets.
You know, it struck me funny. God doesn't lie, but he doesn't have any problem with somebody else going to lie.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something you got to kind of wrestle with here. That God commissioned a spirit to go lie. Or to go deceive Ahab. But what's the purpose of deceiving Ahab? What does God say the purpose is? If you look at verse 20, it'll tell you.
Make good on his word.
Yeah.
That Ahab has to die.
Yeah. God has determined that Ahab has reached the point where it's time for Ahab to face judgment, right? And so, God's kind of setting a trap for Ahab. But isn't it interesting that God tells Ahab the trap? You usually don't tell people the trap, do you?
He's still giving him a choice.
Okay.
He has a choice to listen to what he knows is a true prophet, but he's not choosing that route. But the choice is still there.
Yeah. Okay, good. Ahab has all the information now. He knows that the 400 prophets have been deceived by a lying spirit. He knows that God has determined that he will die in battle, in this upcoming battle. So now he has to decide what he's going to do. And we'll see his decision here in a minute. But how do the prophets react to the news that they've received a false prophecy? How do the prophets react to this side from Micaiah telling them, hey, you've been deceived, you've had a lying spirit?
They were angry.
They're angry. They're angry. Zedekiah, our guy with the horns, who may be the head prophet, certainly seems like it, he goes up and actually strikes Micaiah. Basically says, you're out of your mind. How easy is it for us when we're confronted with being wrong? Or if somebody comes to us and says, hey, you might not have this quite right. It's easy to react like Zedekiah, right? I know that's my temptation. It's never fun being told that you're wrong. And we see here that Zedekiah reacts in anger instead of taking the correction from Micaiah. Any other thoughts about that section there?
One of the hardest things about being told you're wrong is finding the courage to accept that possibility and research it. Most people just refuse to accept it and go on with what they believe.
Yeah, being willing to examine your own beliefs is a harder path, for sure. So Micaiah ends up going back to jail, right? Ahab says, send this guy off to jail. Micaiah gets a few jabs in at folks as he's leaving. He basically tells Zedekiah, you're going to find out that I'm telling the truth on the day you're hiding in a room while the battle is lost. And then he tells the whole crowd, hey, if Ahab comes back, I'm lying. But I'll tell you right now, Ahab's not coming back. And then it's kind of like a mic drop, and then he's out. Alright, so let's see how Ahab reacts to this prophecy. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. So did Ahab listen? No. But Jehoshaphat didn't really listen either, did he?
No.
No. Maybe Jehoshaphat's like, well, I wasn't prophesied to die, so I still want this land, so let's go do it. But yeah, neither one of them takes this prophecy as instruction to not go fight the battle. They both go fight the battle. Kind of interesting. Verse 30. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you put on your robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. So what's Ahab doing here? What's Ahab playing at?
I think he's thinking about what he just heard.
Yeah.
And otherwise, if he wasn't worried about being killed, I don't think he'd disguise himself.
Exactly. So he doesn't believe the prophecy enough to not go fight, but he believes it enough to try to take some action to circumvent it. But we know that there's no circumventing God's will, right? Yes, sir.
Also, you see classic, Ahab, where he tells Jehoshaphat, like, hey, just make sure you're dressed, because he knows enough about battle to know everyone's looking to find the king and kill the king.
Right.
So he's like, make sure you dress up.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
And so it's, if nothing else, he's not only just preserving himself, but he's gonna try to redirect any danger to this other guy, because again, he doesn't care about anybody else.
Yeah.
Really makes you wonder about Jehoshaphat.
That's what I was about to say. I don't know if Jehoshaphat was the brightest tool in the drawer, but or maybe he wasn't worried about it. So yeah, Ahab is trying to find some way to circumvent God's prophecy here. He says, well, if I disguise myself, I'll make it harder for them to find me, and then they won't kill me. But we're going to see that doesn't work out for him. Verse 31, the king of Syria had commanded the 32 captains of his chariots, saying, fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. So this is a targeted attack. We're only going after the king of Israel. So it was when the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat that they said, surely it is the king of Israel. Therefore they turned aside to fight against him, and Jehoshaphat cried out. And it happened when the captains of the chariots saw that it was not the king of Israel, that they turned back from pursuing him. Now this is one of the sections, remember in 2 Chronicles 18 we have this same story told from Judah's point of view. This is one of the sections that's a little bit different. In Judah's telling of the story in 2 Chronicles 18, it says that Jehoshaphat cried out and the Lord heard him. And the Lord turned the chariots away from Jehoshaphat and saved him. So Judah, the nation of Judah attributes Jehoshaphat's saving to God. Verse 34, now a certain man drew a bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the joints of his armor. So he said to the driver of his chariot, turn around and take me out of the battle, for I am wounded. The battle increased that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot, facing the Syrians, and died at evening. The blood ran out from the wound onto the floor of the chariot. Then as the sun was going down, a shout went throughout his army, saying, every man to his city, and every man to his own country. So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria. Then someone washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood while the harlots bathed, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken. Now the rest of the acts of Ahab and all that he did, the ivory house which he built, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Ahab rested with his fathers. Then Ahaziah, his son, reigned in his place. I'll have to get Google to tell me how to pronounce that one for next week. All right, so we see that Jehoshaphat becomes the main target of the attack because he's wearing his kingly attire. But they realize that it's not the king of Israel, it's the king of Judah. They turn aside. So we see here Ahab does not escape God's judgment. Now, as I was reading this, it kind of reminded me of the story of Jonah. Just in the fact of we had two guys who both thought that they could outsmart God, right? Jonah thought he could run far enough away from God that he wouldn't have to do what God said. Ahab thought changing his clothes would be enough to trick God. But we see through these stories that when God has made a decision, nothing that humans can do is going to change that. Ahab was not able to evade God's judgment. And we see in the end here the fulfillment of the prophecy that Elijah gives them at the end of chapter 21. You remember, he tells Ahab that just like the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, so they'll lick up your blood. And there's a little bit of discussion in Jewish tradition, because if you go back and read that full prophecy from Elijah, it says they'll lick up your blood in the same place where they licked up Naboth's blood. And the text doesn't necessarily say that it was the exact same place. And so some Jewish scholars have had some issues with that over the years. They've come up with some theories I'll just share for edification. That they've come up with different ideas, like the blood ran. It says they bathed it in a pool. The blood ran in the water down to the place where Naboth was killed, and dogs licked it there. Or that when he was being transported, it went over that place and blood dripped. Just some different ideas from them as to how that prophecy could have been fully fulfilled. But the text doesn't really say one way or the other the exact location of Ahab's death and where the dogs licked up his blood. So we see here the end of King Ahab. Next week we're going to look at kind of the whole arc of Ahab. We're going to compare him to some of the other kings and leaders throughout God's people throughout the years, and really kind of look more at the leadership aspect of Ahab's life. Why he failed as a leader, why some other kings succeeded as a leader, and what we could learn from Ahab's mistakes. All right, any last thoughts about Ahab's death? And we'll have time next week to talk more.
Seems like when there's somebody, Ahab was killed by a random arrow.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember if it was Saul, but there's somebody else in the Bible that's killed by a random shot.
Yeah.
You remember who it is?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's
We know
somebody
who was
else.
driving the arrow anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not so